Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a slow stroll into medieval Europe. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Pull up a blanket. Maybe fluff your pillow one more time because, unlike our medieval friends, you probably have one that isn't stuffed with suspicious straw and several generations of tiny roommates with 6 legs. Tonight, we're answering a simple question. If you somehow woke up in medieval Europe, how long would you survive? The answer is probably not very long. Not because a dragon would swoop down and carry you away. That would actually be a relatively exciting ending by medieval standards. No, the real danger came from ordinary life. Eating breakfast, walking outside, drinking water, going to sleep, visiting a barber, owning a chimney, existing near another human being. Medieval Europe had a remarkable talent for turning completely normal activities into life-threatening adventures. And somehow, millions of people managed to keep civilization running anyway. So tonight, we're going to wander through that world together. Slowly, calmly, one miserable inconvenience at a time. First things first. Forget almost everything Hollywood taught you. Castles were not magical. Knights were rarely shining. Villages were not charming little collections of flower-covered cottages where cheerful bakers greeted everyone by name. They smelled. They smelled in ways our modern brains struggle to imagine. Imagine every garbage truck in your city deciding to take a month-long vacation. Now add livestock. Now remove plumbing. Now remove soap from most people's daily routine. Then leave everything baking under the summer sun. Congratulations! You're beginning to approach medieval Europe. The smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was information. Long before anyone understood bacteria, your nose constantly reported what was happening around you. Someone tanning leather. Someone boiling animal fat. Someone emptying chamber pots. Someone butchering pigs.
Someone making cheese. Someone trying, and usually failing, to clean fish. Every neighborhood had its own unique scent profile, almost like today's coffee shops, except instead of roasted espresso beans, you got fermented cabbage, wet horses, smoke, and whatever the neighbors accidentally spilled 3 days ago. Oddly enough, people mostly got used to it. Humans adapt remarkably quickly. After all, if you spend your whole life smelling something, eventually your brain quietly says, "I suppose this is normal now." Which is both comforting and slightly horrifying. Now, let's talk about your first morning. You wake up. Congratulations! You survived your first medieval night. That alone deserves recognition. Your bed isn't especially soft. If you're wealthy, maybe you've got a feather mattress. If you're ordinary, it's probably straw. Fresh straw is reasonably comfortable. Unfortunately, fresh is doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence. Straw mattresses weren't replaced every weekend. Sometimes they stayed around for quite a while. As people slept, bits of food fell into the bedding. Dust settled. Moisture collected. Tiny insects moved in. And unlike modern apartment renters, nobody complained to the landlord. Because there wasn't one. The bugs simply became permanent residents. Fleas were especially enthusiastic. For medieval fleas, humans were less like homeowners, and more like all-you-can-eat buffets. People scratched constantly. Letters from the period mention itching so casually that historians barely notice anymore. It was simply part of life. You woke up. You scratched. You continued existing. Then comes getting dressed. Simple enough. Except clothes weren't washed nearly as often as ours. Not because people enjoyed wearing dirty clothing. Laundry was unbelievably difficult. Heating enough water took hours. Soap wasn't cheap. Scrubbing heavy wool garments was exhausting. Drying them during damp weather could take forever. So people often wore the same layers repeatedly. Sometimes for weeks. Underwear, if you owned any, might get washed more often. Outer clothing. Well, let's just say medieval fashion valued endurance over freshness. Fortunately, everyone else smelled about the same. No one was winning any fragrance competitions. Eventually, breakfast arrives. Wonderful. Except breakfast itself presents several opportunities for disaster. Let's begin with bread. Bread was the foundation of medieval life. Rich people had fine white bread. Poor people ate darker loaves filled with barley, rye, oats, or whatever happened to be available that year. Some years, grain supplies were excellent. Other years, people became surprisingly creative. Tree bark, ground peas, beans, acorns, various mysterious fillers. If it vaguely resembled flour, someone probably baked it. Now here's the interesting part. Medieval flour wasn't always pure. Millstones gradually wore down while grinding grain. Tiny fragments of stone mixed into the flour. Day after day, year after year. Imagine eating microscopic sandpaper with every meal. Modern archaeologists examining medieval skeletons often notice something fascinating. Their teeth. Or rather, what remained of them. Many adults had teeth worn almost flat. Not entirely from age, but from decades of chewing bread containing fine stone dust. Breakfast literally sanded your teeth away. Not exactly the balanced breakfast your dentist recommends. Although, to be fair, your dentist wouldn't exist for another several centuries. Perhaps you'd like something to drink. Water seems obvious. Except, water wasn't always trustworthy. Now, contrary to popular myths, medieval people absolutely did drink water. They weren't wandering around surviving entirely on beer. That would make afternoon farming rather complicated. But water quality depended entirely on where you lived. A mountain spring. Wonderful. A village well. Hopefully acceptable. A river flowing directly past livestock, workshops, and several hundred people without plumbing? Perhaps. Consider thinking twice. Except thinking twice didn't always help. Sometimes there simply wasn't another option. Clean drinking water was a luxury many communities couldn't consistently guarantee. Nobody knew about bacteria. Nobody knew about viruses. They judged water mostly by appearance and taste. If it looked acceptable, people drank it. Sometimes they stayed healthy. Sometimes, not so much. Beer, surprisingly, often became a safer alternative. Not because alcohol magically killed every dangerous organism. Modern myths exaggerate that idea. Instead, brewing required boiling water. That boiling step could reduce many harmful microbes before fermentation even began. Small beer, with very low alcohol content, became an everyday drink for many families. Children sometimes drank it too. Not because medieval parents were hosting toddler tavern nights. It simply contained very little alcohol and could be a practical source of hydration and calories. History often sounds strange until you remember the alternatives. Now let's leave the house. The streets await. And they are less than welcoming. Roads inside towns weren't paved in the modern sense. Some were. Many weren't. Rain quickly transformed dirt into deep mud. Horses added their contributions. Pigs wandered freely through some communities. Dogs searched for scraps. Chickens ignored everyone equally. Meanwhile, carts rolled through, splashing absolutely everything. Walking became an exercise in careful foot placement. One careless step, and your boots gained several pounds. If you owned boots, many poorer people didn't, which makes every muddy street considerably more personal. You might notice something falling from an upstairs window. Hopefully not onto you. People often emptied chamber pots outside. Sometimes carefully. Sometimes with a warning. Sometimes. Apparently optimism replaced accuracy. Different towns had different customs. Some required residents to shout before dumping waste. Whether everyone remembered to shout is another question. Imagine strolling peacefully through town, only to discover gravity has selected you for an unpleasant surprise. The Middle Ages occasionally rewarded bad timing with unforgettable consequences. Animals lived everywhere, not in carefully fenced suburban yards. Right beside people, inside homes, around markets, along roads. Cats hunted mice. Dogs wandered. Pigs scavenged. Geese defended territory with remarkable confidence. If you've ever been chased by an angry goose, you're already familiar with one timeless aspect of history. Some experiences truly transcend the centuries. Livestock also attracted rats. Lots of rats, which themselves carried fleas. We'll return to those little creatures later. Trust me. Unfortunately, they become extremely important. Now suppose you're lucky enough to visit a bustling medieval market. It seems lively. Colorful fabrics, fresh vegetables, loud merchants, children running between stalls, musicians attempting entertainment. The smell of roasting meat drifts through the air. For a moment, it almost feels pleasant, until you remember refrigeration doesn't exist. Food preservation depends on salt, smoke, drying, pickling, timing. A merchant selling meat has every incentive to convince you today's product is perfectly fresh. Whether reality agrees, well, that's between you and your stomach. Food poisoning wasn't understood. People simply knew certain meals were followed by deep regret. Sometimes they blamed bad air. Sometimes unlucky stars. Sometimes witches. Humans have always been remarkably inventive when explaining things they couldn't yet understand. Let's pause for a second. Because it's easy to think medieval people were foolish. They weren't. They were intelligent people solving problems with the knowledge available. If you had been born in the year 1250 instead of today, you would almost certainly believe many of the same things they did. History is humbling like that. Every generation quietly assumes it has finally figured everything out. Future historians usually disagree, quite enthusiastically. As the day continues, you'll notice something else. Almost everyone works. Hard. Very hard. Farming. Smithing. Weaving. Building. Cooking. Carrying. Digging. Life depended on physical labor. There were no weekends as we understand them. No paid vacation. No ergonomic office chairs. Certainly no emails asking whether you'd like to attend another unnecessary meeting. In fairness, that last one may actually count as progress. Still, medieval work came with dangers we'll explore later. Broken bones, falling beams, runaway horses, sharp tools, heavy carts, open fires. Every profession seemed to carry its own unique method of shortening your life expectancy. Quite considerate, really. It meant everyone had options. As evening slowly settles across the village, smoke curls from hundreds of chimneys. Families gather around hearth fires. Simple meals simmer in iron pots. Stories are shared. Candles flicker. Children yawn. Dogs curl beside the warmth. For a brief moment, life feels peaceful. And despite everything we've discussed tonight, it often was. People laughed, fell in love, raised families, celebrated festivals, played games, told jokes, complained about taxes. Some things, it seems, never change. But beneath that ordinary evening, danger never truly disappeared. A single spark could burn an entire town. A tiny cut could become life-threatening. A spoiled meal could end a family. An unseen disease could arrive without warning. In medieval Europe, survival wasn't achieved through extraordinary heroics. It came one ordinary day at a time. And tomorrow, our gentle walk through history becomes considerably less healthy. Because we'll meet the invisible enemies medieval people feared, misunderstood, and almost never escaped. Tiny creatures they never knew existed, that quietly shaped the fate of kingdoms, villages, and millions of lives. So settle in, get comfortable, and perhaps be quietly grateful that your drinking water probably isn't sharing a well with the local pig. Tomorrow, unfortunately for our medieval travelers, things only get worse. Morning arrives again. Against all odds, you have survived your first full day in medieval Europe. Honestly, you're doing better than expected. You haven't been run over by an ox cart. You haven't accidentally eaten bread that doubles as sandpaper. Nothing particularly unpleasant has fallen out of a second-story window onto your head. So far. A respectable performance. Unfortunately, today introduces a much more serious problem. The things trying to kill you aren't always visible. If yesterday's dangers were loud and muddy, today's are silent. They're hiding in water, on your clothes, in your food, inside your own home, on the family dog, and occasionally, on your best friend. The truly unfair part is that medieval people couldn't see any of it. No one had looked through a microscope. No one had heard the word bacteria. Viruses were centuries away from being understood. As far as most people knew, sickness simply happened. One day your neighbor looked perfectly healthy. The next day he was lying in bed with a fever. By the end of the week, the church bells were ringing again. Nobody could point to the exact reason. Human beings dislike mysteries. So naturally, they invented explanations. Some blamed bad air. Others blamed unusual weather. Certain people blamed angry planets. Some blamed sinners. A few blamed foreigners. And, because humanity has always enjoyed making difficult situations even worse, others blamed completely innocent people who happened to be different. History is filled with examples of frightened societies searching desperately for someone to blame. Unfortunately, fear rarely produces good decisions. Let's begin with one of medieval Europe's greatest enemies. The flea. Yes, that tiny little insect. Barely noticeable. Easy to ignore. A creature that weighs less than a paperclip somehow managed to change the history of continents. It's honestly impressive. Fleas loved medieval Europe. They loved warm houses. They loved straw mattresses. They loved wool blankets. They loved dogs, cats, rats, humans. Really, they weren't particularly picky. If something had blood and stayed still long enough, the flea considered it a wonderful opportunity. Modern pest control didn't exist. No sprays. No treatments. No professional exterminators arriving in an unmarked van. People simply lived with insects. Some combed them from their hair. Some picked them from clothing. Some accepted constant itching as a perfectly ordinary part of existence. Imagine spending your entire life believing that scratching every few minutes was completely normal. Because for many people, it was. Now, to be fair, most fleas were simply annoying. Annoying is manageable. History would have been much kinder if fleas had stopped there. Instead, certain fleas carried passengers. Tiny bacteria that no one could possibly see. One bite. One infected flea. One rat wandering into town. And suddenly an entire community found itself facing a disaster no one understood. We'll spend more time with the plague later. It deserves that attention. For now, it's enough to understand one thing. Sometimes history wasn't changed by kings. Sometimes it was changed by an insect smaller than your fingernail. That's a humbling thought. Napoleon dreamed of conquering Europe. A flea accidentally managed something arguably more impressive. Of course, fleas weren't working alone. They had plenty of equally unpleasant colleagues. Head lice. Body lice. The medieval equivalent of extremely unwanted roommates. Children caught them. Adults caught them. Nobles caught them. Kings caught them. Queens caught them. Apparently, lice believed firmly in social equality. A rare virtue. People regularly searched each other's hair. Parents checked children. Servants checked nobles. Friends helped friends. It was simply another ordinary household task. Rather like folding laundry today. Only considerably itchier. Some historians have found tiny combs specifically designed for removing lice. Beautifully carved. Carefully crafted. Which somehow makes the entire situation even stranger. Imagine spending hours creating an elegant object, whose sole purpose was removing bugs from someone's scalp. Human creativity truly knows no limits. Then there were worms. Not exactly the exciting kind found in adventure stories. Much less glamorous. These worms lived inside people. Poor sanitation. Contaminated food. Unwashed vegetables. Dirty hands. All made infection surprisingly common. Many medieval children almost certainly carried intestinal parasites at some point. Adults too. Symptoms varied. Some people became weak. Others struggled to gain weight. Many simply accepted constant stomach discomfort as another ordinary feature of life. It's astonishing what humans can normalize. If everyone around you complains about stomach pain, eventually you stop asking questions. Now let's wander into the medieval kitchen. At first glance, it seems cozy. A large fire crackles beneath an iron pot. Fresh herbs hang from wooden beams. Bread cools on a table. Someone stirs a stew that's been cooking for hours. Comforting. Almost peaceful. Except kitchens presented dangers nobody recognized. Take milk. Fresh milk spoils quickly. Today we refrigerate it. Back then, you drank it quickly. Or turned it into cheese. Or butter. Leave it sitting too long. And nature quietly begins conducting chemistry experiments without asking permission. The same applies to meat, fish, eggs, practically everything. Without refrigeration, food preservation became an endless race against time. Sometimes people won. Sometimes the bacteria won. Of course, nobody blamed bacteria. Nobody knew they existed. Instead, they might say the food had gone bad because of heat. Or bad luck. Or perhaps because someone had offended heaven. The explanation changed. The stomachache remained remarkably consistent. Let's not forget drinking vessels. Imagine sharing one wooden cup among several family members. Perfectly ordinary. Someone drinks. Hands it to the next person. Who hands it to someone else. No one thinks twice. Why would they? Invisible germs weren't exactly introducing themselves beforehand. Communal eating worked much the same way. Several people dipping bread into the same bowl. Sharing knives. Passing cups. Entire families gathered closely around meals. Warm. Friendly. Ideal conditions for sharing far more than conversation. Speaking of conversations, have you noticed how close everyone stands? Medieval homes were often crowded. Very crowded. Large families. Servants. Visitors. Occasionally animals. Everyone sharing limited space. Privacy wasn't really part of everyday life. If one person developed a cough, everyone heard it. Eventually, everyone probably caught it too. Respiratory illnesses spread remarkably well inside smoky, crowded houses. Especially during winter. Windows stayed closed. Doors remained shut. Smoke from the fire drifted through every room. People inhaled it daily. Not because they enjoyed smoke. Because warmth mattered more. Choosing between fresh air and freezing temperatures isn't much of a choice. Especially in January. Let's visit a monastery. Surprisingly peaceful. Rows of quiet monks. Carefully copied books. Gardens. Prayer. Order. Routine. Monasteries often became centers of learning. They also became places where sick travelers sought help. Many monks cared for the ill. They offered food. Shelter. Simple treatments. Comfort. It was genuine compassion. Unfortunately, compassion sometimes came with consequences. Without understanding infection, caregivers unknowingly exposed themselves repeatedly. Helping the sick could easily make you one of them. History owes countless anonymous caregivers enormous respect. They risked everything, without fully understanding what they were risking. Meanwhile, medieval doctors did the best they could, which is a sentence historians say quite often. Medical education existed. Universities taught medicine. Doctors studied respected ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates. The problem was, those authorities occasionally happened to be wrong. Quite confidently wrong. One enormously popular idea involved balancing the body's four humors. Blood. Yellow bile. Black bile. Phlegm. Too much of one. Illness followed. Restore balance. Health returned. Simple. Elegant. Unfortunately, human biology ignored the theory almost completely. Still, for centuries it shaped medicine. Because when an idea survives long enough, it becomes difficult to question, even when reality quietly disagrees. This is where bloodletting enters the story. Perhaps you have a fever. Perhaps your stomach hurts. Perhaps your head aches. The doctor considers your symptoms, thinks carefully, then decides. You probably have too much blood. Problem solved. Well, attempted. Out comes the sharp instrument. Blood leaves your body. Hopefully your illness follows. Sometimes patients recovered afterward. Mostly because many illnesses improve naturally. Doctors understandably took this as evidence the treatment worked. Confirmation bias has been around for a very long time. Herbal medicine also played a huge role. To be fair, some herbs genuinely helped. Willow bark contains compounds related to aspirin. Honey has antibacterial properties. Mint can soothe digestion. Certain medieval remedies were surprisingly sensible. Others, less so. Recipes sometimes included powdered gemstones, ground animal parts, odd combinations that sound more like someone cleaning out a pantry than practicing medicine. People experimented constantly. Sometimes they stumbled onto useful discoveries. Sometimes they created expensive soup. Now imagine something much simpler. A tiny splinter. Nothing dramatic. You've had dozens before. Except this time. It becomes infected. The finger swells. It grows hot. Pain increases. Pus forms. Without antibiotics, even minor injuries carried genuine risk. A scratch from gardening. A kitchen knife. A nail sticking from a wooden fence. Small wounds occasionally became deadly. Today we'd visit a clinic. Receive antibiotics. Complain mildly about waiting 20 minutes. Back then, you hoped. Hope was a major component of medieval healthcare. Children faced these dangers constantly. They explored, played, fell down, caught illnesses, shared everything. Modern childhood includes scraped knees. Medieval childhood included scraped knees. Plus diseases modern vaccines have largely pushed into history. Many families sadly expected not every child would reach adulthood. It sounds heartbreaking because it was. Parents loved their children every bit as deeply as parents do today, which made loss no less painful, perhaps even more frightening because it happened so often. As evening approaches once again, candles begin flickering inside cottages across Europe. Families gather around the fire. Someone coughs quietly. Nobody thinks much of it. Another person feels unusually tired. Perhaps tomorrow will be better. A child scratches at flea bites before climbing into bed. Outside, rats move silently through dark streets. Inside, the fire crackles gently. Life continues exactly as it did yesterday. Ordinary, comfortable, familiar. And that was precisely what made invisible dangers so dangerous. They didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly. Shared your meal. Slept in your bed. Drank from your cup. Walked beside you through the market. History often remembers dramatic battles and famous kings. But for millions of ordinary people, the greatest enemy was something they could neither see nor understand. And unfortunately, our medieval journey is about to become even more uncomfortable. Because next time, we'll meet the diseases that entire towns feared by name. And one particular outbreak that transformed Europe forever, leaving villages silent, kingdoms weakened, and generations forever changed. Sleep well. Our tiny invisible enemies have only just begun their work. By now, you've done remarkably well. You've survived the muddy streets, the questionable drinking water, the fleas, the suspicious stew, the doctor who seemed strangely enthusiastic about removing your blood. Against all expectations, you're still here. Unfortunately, medieval Europe had one final habit that made life especially unpredictable. Every now and then, disease didn't just visit one family. It visited everyone. Sometimes an illness appeared quietly. One person developed a fever. A few days later, another neighbor stayed in bed. The village baker didn't open his shop. The blacksmith's apprentice disappeared from work. The church bells rang a little more often than usual. People noticed, but they rarely panicked immediately. After all, people became sick all the time. Perhaps this would pass. Perhaps it was simply another bad season. Perhaps the weather would change. People have always been optimistic at first. History suggests that optimism rarely survives contact with reality. Imagine you're living in a small medieval village. Nothing unusual has happened for months. The harvest is growing. Children chase chickens through the square. Someone argues loudly over the price of onions. Life continues with its usual collection of tiny inconveniences. Then, a traveler arrives. Travelers brought exciting things. Stories from distant cities. New fabrics. Fresh gossip. Sometimes strange foods. Sometimes letters. Occasionally they also carried something far less welcome. Not intentionally. They had no idea. One healthy-looking traveler could unknowingly carry an illness from hundreds of miles away. Within days, people who had never left their own village found themselves sharing a disease from another kingdom. The medieval world wasn't isolated. Trade connected cities across Europe. Ships crossed seas. Merchants followed ancient roads. Pilgrims visited holy places. Armies marched endlessly. Every road that carried goods could also carry disease. The world was smaller than many people imagine. Unfortunately, germs appreciated good transportation just as much as merchants did. One of the most common illnesses wasn't particularly dramatic. It was the humble cold, or influenza, or one of dozens of respiratory infections. People coughed, sneezed, developed fevers, recovered, or sometimes didn't. Without modern medicine, even illnesses we now consider routine could become dangerous. Especially for the elderly. Especially for infants. Especially for anyone already weakened by hunger. Modern healthcare quietly protects us in ways we rarely stop to appreciate. Today, catching the flu is usually an inconvenience. Back then, it could become a family tragedy. Then came dysentery. Not exactly history's most glamorous subject, but unfortunately, a very common one. Poor sanitation made stomach diseases almost unavoidable. Contaminated water, improperly stored food, dirty cooking equipment, crowded living conditions. Everything worked together to create perfect opportunities for intestinal infections. The symptoms were miserable. Severe diarrhea, pain, weakness, dehydration. Modern hospitals treat dehydration with remarkable efficiency. A simple 4-bag can save a life. Medieval Europe did not have 4 bags. People became weaker day after day. Many recovered naturally. Many never did. It's astonishing how dangerous losing water can become when no one understands how to replace it properly. Children suffered especially hard. A child who became dehydrated could decline frighteningly fast. Parents tried everything they knew. Herbal teas, broths, prayers, rest. Sometimes these helped. Sometimes nothing did. The hardest part wasn't the lack of love. It was the lack of knowledge. Parents cared deeply. Doctors genuinely wanted to help. Everyone was trying. Human biology simply wasn't sharing its instruction manual. Let's wander into a medieval hospital. The word hospital creates certain expectations. Bright lights, clean sheets, machines quietly beeping, doctors in white coats. You won't find much of that here. Instead, picture a large hall. Rows of wooden beds. Some separated by curtains. Many not. Windows open when weather allows. Candles flickering. Monks or nuns moving quietly between patients. Offering food. Changing bandages. Whispering prayers. The atmosphere wasn't cruel. In fact, many medieval hospitals were surprisingly compassionate. Their greatest limitation wasn't kindness. It was science. Caregivers understood comfort. They understood cleanliness better than many people assume. Some hospitals encouraged washing, fresh linens when possible, ventilation, nutritious food. Those ideas genuinely helped. But without understanding infection itself, there was only so much anyone could do. Patients with entirely different illnesses often shared the same room. Doctors moved from bed to bed. Hands washed occasionally. Not always. Because nobody yet understood the invisible danger passing from one patient to another. Then there was smallpox, a disease feared across continents. Unlike some illnesses, smallpox often announced itself dramatically. Fever, fatigue, then the unmistakable rash. Survivors frequently carried scars for life. Faces marked forever by an illness they had defeated. Some lost their eyesight. Others lost family members. Communities dreaded its arrival. Unlike a broken bone, smallpox spread. One household became 2. 2 became 10. Soon an entire village whispered the same worried questions. Who's next? Will it reach our house? Should we leave? Leaving, unfortunately, often meant carrying the disease somewhere else. History repeatedly demonstrates one frustrating truth. Humans tend to flee danger. Disease happily travels with them. Now imagine rumors. Before newspapers. Before radio. Before the internet. News traveled person to person. A merchant arrives from another town. He mentions an illness. Someone else heard about it from a traveler. A priest receives word from a nearby monastery. Nobody knows exactly what's happening. Every retelling changes slightly. By the time the story reaches your village, the facts have become wonderfully creative. Apparently half the neighboring town has died. Or maybe everyone recovered. Or perhaps wolves are involved somehow. Rumors behave much like diseases. They spread quickly. They mutate constantly. And they rarely improve with age. People searched desperately for patterns. Did the disease strike only the poor? Not always. Only children? No. Only old people. Again. Not really. Sometimes nobles became ill. Sometimes peasants remained healthy. Sometimes entire households escaped untouched while the neighbors suffered terribly. To medieval observers, illness often appeared completely random. Randomness is difficult for human beings to accept. We prefer reasons, even imaginary ones. Astrologers gained attention during difficult times. Perhaps the planets had aligned incorrectly. Maybe Mars was influencing human health. Maybe Saturn deserved blame this week. It sounds unusual today, but remember, people worked with the information available. Astronomy and astrology remained closely connected for centuries. Many educated physicians consulted star charts before treating patients. It seems strange now. Yet 500 years from today, future generations may look at some of our own ideas with exactly the same amused confusion. History has a wonderfully humbling way of doing that. Religion shaped nearly every response to illness. Churches filled quickly. Special prayers were organized. Communities gathered in hope. Some believed disease represented a test of faith. Others saw punishment. Many simply asked for mercy. For countless people, religion provided something medicine couldn't. Comfort, hope, a sense that suffering might still have meaning. Whether or not illness disappeared, people rarely faced it completely alone. Neighbors often cared for one another. Families remained together. Priests visited the sick. Monasteries distributed food. History remembers epidemics. It should also remember kindness. Because kindness appeared almost everywhere. Quietly. Without expecting recognition. Of course, not everyone responded wisely. Fear changes people. Sometimes dramatically. Strangers became suspicious. Travelers were questioned. Merchants found fewer customers. Communities occasionally closed their gates. Some towns restricted movement. Others attempted isolation. Without understanding exactly how diseases spread, Their efforts produced mixed results. Sometimes they accidentally helped. Sometimes they accidentally trapped healthy people alongside the sick. Good intentions don't always guarantee good outcomes. History offers many examples. Let's return to your little village. Several weeks have passed. The outbreak begins fading. The blacksmith returns to work. Children laugh in the streets again. The market grows busy. Life resumes. Almost. Certain chairs remain empty. Certain houses stay quiet. Fields go untended because the people who work them are gone. Loss leaves invisible marks on communities. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just noticeable. A missing voice. An unopened shop. A favorite storyteller who never returns to the village square. History often counts deaths. It rarely counts silence. As Europe slowly recovered from one illness, another eventually appeared. Different symptoms, different fears, different explanations. Disease never signed a schedule announcing its next visit. People simply lived with uncertainty. Harvests mattered. Weather mattered. Politics mattered. But illness could ignore all of them. A king and a shepherd both developed fevers. Disease cared remarkably little about social status, although wealth certainly improved your chances. A warm house, better food, cleaner water, private rooms, all helped. Money couldn't guarantee survival, but it certainly made survival more comfortable. Some advantages never change. And then, during the middle of the 14th century, something arrived that made every previous outbreak seem almost manageable. An illness so devastating that generations afterwards still spoke about it in frightened voices.
Village disappeared.
Cities transformed. Kingdoms changed forever. The disease became known by many names. Today, we usually call it the Black Death. We'll spend plenty of time with it next. Not because it's the most dramatic story in medieval history, but because it's impossible to understand medieval Europe without understanding the plague. It changed economies, families, religion, politics, even the way people thought about life itself. All because of something no one could see. So tonight, as you settle beneath a comfortable blanket in a house with clean water, modern medicine, and windows that actually keep the rain outside, take one quiet moment to appreciate how extraordinary ordinary life has become. Our medieval traveler. Unfortunately, certain houses stay quiet. Fields go untended because the people who work them are gone. Loss leaves invisible marks on communities. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just noticeable. A missing voice. An unopened shop. A favorite storyteller who never returns to the village square. History often counts deaths. It rarely counts silence. As Europe slowly recovered from one illness, another eventually appeared. Different symptoms, different fears, different explanations. Disease never signed a schedule announcing its next visit. People simply lived with uncertainty. Harvests mattered. Weather mattered. Politics mattered. But illness could ignore all of them. A king and a shepherd both developed fevers. Disease cared remarkably little about social status, although wealth certainly improved your chances. A warm house, better food, cleaner water, private rooms, all helped. Money couldn't guarantee survival, but it certainly made survival more comfortable. Some advantages never change. And then, during the middle of the 14th century, something arrived that made every previous outbreak seem almost manageable. An illness so devastating that generations afterwards still spoke about it in frightened voices.
Village disappeared.
Cities transformed. Kingdoms changed forever. The disease became known by many names. Today, we usually call it the Black Death. We'll spend plenty of time with it next. Not because it's the most dramatic story in medieval history, but because it's impossible to understand medieval Europe without understanding the plague. It changed economies, families, religion, politics, even the way people thought about life itself. All because of something no one could see. So tonight, as you settle beneath a comfortable blanket in a house with clean water, modern medicine, and windows that actually keep the rain outside, take one quiet moment to appreciate how extraordinary ordinary life has become. Our medieval traveler, unfortunately, is about to discover that the worst chapter has not yet arrived. So, here we are. Our medieval traveler has survived dirty water, questionable food, invisible germs, doctors with an alarming amount of confidence, and enough fleas to start their own tiny kingdom. You might be thinking, surely things can't get much worse. History smiles politely. Oh, they absolutely can. It is the year 1347. Across Europe, life carries on much as it always has. Farmers rise before sunrise. Church bells echo across villages. Merchants haggle over cloth and grain. Children chase each other through muddy streets. A baker pulls fresh loaves from his oven. A blacksmith wipes sweat from his face. Everything feels ordinary. And history has an unfortunate habit of changing when everything feels perfectly ordinary. Far to the east, trade routes had been busy for centuries. Silk, spices, precious stones, exotic fabrics, ideas, religions, languages. The medieval world was far more connected than many people imagine. Merchants crossed deserts. Ships crossed seas. Caravans crossed mountains. Every journey carried something valuable. Sometimes, they carried something else. Something nobody could see. Nobody could smell. Nobody could bargain with. The plague didn't arrive wearing a crown. It didn't announce itself with trumpets. It simply traveled, patiently, quietly, following the same roads everyone else used. History often focuses on kings. Disease-preferred merchants. One autumn day, several merchant ships reached the Mediterranean. To the people waiting at the docks, it probably looked like another ordinary arrival. Ships came and went constantly. Ports were noisy places. Sailors shouted.
Dock-workers unloaded cargo.
Fish sellers argued over prices. Children watched enormous vessels glide into harbor. Business as usual. Until people noticed. Something was wrong. Some sailors never came ashore. Others looked desperately ill. A few had already died during the voyage. Nobody fully understood what they were seeing. But everyone understood one thing. Something terrible had arrived. Imagine standing on that dock. The sea breeze carries the familiar smell of salt water. Ropes creak. Wooden ships gently knock against one another. Nearby, merchants continue discussing prices. Life refuses to stop immediately. It almost never does. Even during disasters. People still eat breakfast. They still argue. They still buy bread. History doesn't pause dramatically while ominous music plays. It simply keeps moving. One ordinary day blending quietly into the next. Within weeks, people began falling ill. Not hundreds. Not thousands. Just enough for concern. A neighbor develops a fever. A shopkeeper doesn't open his store. Someone whispers about strange swellings. Another family hangs black cloth outside their home. Church bells begin ringing more often. Still, many believed it would pass. Diseases came and went. Europe had seen illness before. Surely this would be another difficult season. Perhaps winter would end it. Perhaps warmer weather. Perhaps prayer. Hope has always been humanity's favorite first response. Unfortunately, the plague had different plans. Unlike many diseases, this one spread with astonishing speed. Entire households became sick. Villages watched healthy neighbors become bedridden within days. Doctors found themselves overwhelmed. Priests moved constantly from house to house. Gravediggers worked until exhaustion. Nobody could explain why one family survived while another vanished almost entirely. It felt random. Randomness is terrifying. Because you can't prepare for it. You can't negotiate with it. You simply wait. and hope your door remains unopened. Now, let's clear up one common myth. People often imagine medieval cities as endless mountains of rats, every street overflowing with rodents. Reality was a little more complicated. Rats certainly played an important role. Nobody fully understood what they were seeing. But everyone understood one thing. Something terrible had arrived. Imagine standing on that dock. The sea breeze carries the familiar smell of salt water. Ropes creak. Wooden ships gently knock against one another. Nearby, merchants continue discussing prices. Life refuses to stop immediately. It almost never does. Even during disasters. People still eat breakfast. They still argue. They still buy bread. History doesn't pause dramatically while ominous music plays. It simply keeps moving. One ordinary day blending quietly into the next. Within weeks, people began falling ill. Not hundreds. Not thousands. Just enough for concern. A neighbor develops a fever. A shopkeeper doesn't open his store. Someone whispers about strange swellings. Another family hangs black cloth outside their home. Church bells begin ringing more often. Still, many believed it would pass. Diseases came and went. Europe had seen illness before. Surely this would be another difficult season. Perhaps winter would end it. Perhaps warmer weather. Perhaps prayer. Hope has always been humanity's favorite first response. Unfortunately, the plague had different plans. Unlike many diseases, this one spread with astonishing speed. Entire households became sick. Villages watched healthy neighbors become bedridden within days. Doctors found themselves overwhelmed. Priests moved constantly from house to house. Gravediggers worked until exhaustion. Nobody could explain why one family survived while another vanished almost entirely. It felt random. Randomness is terrifying. Because you can't prepare for it. You can't negotiate with it. You simply wait. And hope your door remains unopened. Now, let's clear up one common myth. People often imagine medieval cities as endless mountains of rats. Every street overflowing with rodents. Reality was a little more complicated. Rats certainly played an important role. But modern historians still debate exactly how the plague spread in different places. Fleas, rats, human parasites, respiratory transmission. Different outbreaks may have behaved differently. History, frustratingly, refuses to fit neatly into simple explanations, which historians secretly enjoy. It keeps everyone employed. What people absolutely noticed was the illness itself. High fever, extreme weakness, pain, and swollen lymph nodes. These painful swellings often appeared near the neck, the armpits, the groin. People called them buboes. They could become frighteningly large. No one knew why. Some believed poison had entered the body. Others blamed corrupted air. Many thought the stars had aligned against humanity. A few suspected the end of the world had finally arrived. To be fair, if entire neighborhoods suddenly became gravely ill, you might wonder the same thing. Doctors did what doctors always do. They tried. That deserves remembering. It's easy to laugh at medieval medicine. But these were people confronting something completely beyond their understanding. They examined patients, recorded symptoms, suggested treatments. Some burned fragrant herbs. Others recommended special diets. Some practiced bloodletting. Again, because apparently removing blood remained history's favorite solution. If your leg hurts, blood. If you have a fever, blood. If your cat seems unusually grumpy, well, perhaps not that. But the general enthusiasm remained impressive. One famous image from history shows plague doctors wearing long robes and bird-like masks. You've probably seen them. They're unforgettable. However, there's a small twist. Those famous masks mostly appeared centuries after the first Black Death. Not during the great outbreak of the 1340s. History occasionally edits its own wardrobe. Still, The idea behind them reveals something fascinating. Doctors believed pleasant smells might protect them from disease. So the masks were stuffed with herbs. Rose petals, lavender, mint, juniper, whatever smelled nice. Because if bad air caused illness, surely good smells offered protection. It sounds almost comforting. Unfortunately, bacteria remained completely unconvinced. As fear spread, daily life changed. Markets grew quieter. Travel slowed. Neighbors visited less often. Families stayed indoors. Some towns attempted quarantines. Ships arriving from distant ports were ordered to wait before unloading. Interestingly, this idea actually helped. Not because people understood microbes, but because separating potentially sick travelers reduced transmission. Sometimes history discovers useful solutions before understanding why they work. Not everyone stayed calm. Fear rarely encourages rational behavior. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed poisoned wells caused the plague. Others insisted foreign merchants had brought a curse. Conspiracy theories traveled almost as quickly as disease itself. Apparently, that tradition has survived remarkably well into modern times. Some habits never disappear. Thankfully, there were also extraordinary examples of courage. Doctors continued treating patients. Nuns cared for strangers. Monks buried the dead. Neighbors shared food with isolated families. Ordinary people performed quiet acts of kindness every single day. History often remembers panic. It should spend more time remembering compassion. Because compassion remained astonishingly common. Even when people were afraid. Perhaps especially then. Meanwhile, the countryside offered no guaranteed safety. Many families fled crowded cities. Some escaped successfully. Others unknowingly carried illness into villages that had been untouched. A peaceful farming community might wake one week believing itself perfectly safe, only to discover sickness arriving with exhausted travelers seeking shelter. So the masks were stuffed with herbs. Rose petals, lavender, mint, juniper, whatever smelled nice. Because if bad air caused illness, surely good smells offered protection. It sounds almost comforting. Unfortunately, bacteria remained completely unconvinced. As fear spread, daily life changed. Markets grew quieter. Travel slowed. Neighbors visited less often. Families stayed indoors. Some towns attempted quarantines. Ships arriving from distant ports were ordered to wait before unloading. Interestingly, this idea actually helped. Not because people understood microbes, but because separating potentially sick travelers reduced transmission. Sometimes history discovers useful solutions before understanding why they work. Not everyone stayed calm. Fear rarely encourages rational behavior. Rumors multiplied. Some claimed poisoned wells caused the plague. Others insisted foreign merchants had brought a curse. Conspiracy theories traveled almost as quickly as disease itself. Apparently, that tradition has survived remarkably well into modern times. Some habits never disappear. Thankfully, there were also extraordinary examples of courage. Doctors continued treating patients. Nuns cared for strangers. Monks buried the dead. Neighbors shared food with isolated families. Ordinary people performed quiet acts of kindness every single day. History often remembers panic. It should spend more time remembering compassion. Because compassion remained astonishingly common. Even when people were afraid. Perhaps especially then. Meanwhile, the countryside offered no guaranteed safety. Many families fled crowded cities. Some escaped successfully. Others unknowingly carried illness into villages that had been untouched. A peaceful farming community might wake one week believing itself perfectly safe, only to discover sickness arriving with exhausted travelers seeking shelter. The disease didn't care whether you lived behind city walls or beside wheat fields. It simply followed people, patiently. As months passed, Europe changed. Not gradually. Suddenly, fields stood empty. Workshops closed. Churches struggled to keep up with funerals. Entire streets fell silent. Survivors looked around and realized familiar faces had disappeared. Not famous people. Ordinary people. The baker. The shepherd. The woman who sold apples every Tuesday. The old man who always fed pigeons near the church steps. History isn't only shaped by kings and queens. Sometimes it's reshaped because thousands of ordinary lives quietly vanish. And yet, life continued. It always does. Children were born. Crops still needed harvesting. Bread still had to be baked. Someone still had to repair broken roofs. Even after unimaginable hardship, people rebuilt. Communities adapted. The medieval world proved remarkably resilient. Human beings usually are. Given enough time. Something unexpected also happened. Workers became more valuable. With fewer laborers available, many surviving peasants discovered they could demand better wages. Landowners suddenly found themselves competing for workers. Imagine that. For generations, labor had been abundant. Now it wasn't. One disease quietly shifted the balance of power. Kings noticed. Nobles noticed. Everyone noticed. Economic history can sound surprisingly boring, until you realize it changed millions of ordinary lives. The plague also transformed religion. Some people's faith grew stronger. Others questioned everything they had believed. Churches remained central to medieval life. But difficult questions lingered. Why had good people died? Why children? Why entire families? Questions like these rarely have simple answers. Every generation asks them. Every generation struggles. Artists changed too. Paintings increasingly included reminders of mortality. Skeletons appeared in artwork. Hourglasses. Fading flowers. The message was simple. Life is brief. Enjoy it while you can. Not exactly cheerful, but understandable. When an entire continent experiences enormous loss, its art begins reflecting that experience. By the time the worst of the Black Death had passed, Europe was no longer quite the same place. The buildings looked familiar. The castles still stood. The rivers continued flowing. But the people, and the way they understood their world, had changed forever. Not because they wanted change, because history occasionally insists upon it. As evening settles over our medieval landscape once again, the roads slowly become busy. Merchants cautiously resume traveling. Children laugh again in village squares. Farmers return to their fields. Life doesn't forget. But it does continue. The plague would return many times over the following centuries. Not always as devastating, but never entirely gone. For medieval people, the memory remained. A quiet reminder that ordinary life could change with astonishing speed. And as our traveler lays down on that familiar straw mattress, perhaps scratching absent-mindedly at another flea bite, there is finally a small sense of relief. Surely the worst danger is behind us. Surely tomorrow will be a little easier. History, once again, has other ideas. Because disease wasn't the only thing trying to shorten your life. Next time, we'll leave sickness behind for a while and discover how perfectly ordinary jobs, baking bread, building houses, farming fields, and even warming yourself by the fire, could become surprisingly dangerous in medieval Europe. As it turns out, you didn't need a plague to have a very bad day. So, you survived the plague. That's genuinely impressive. Statistically speaking, you've done rather well. You've avoided contaminated wells. You've escaped invisible diseases. You've managed not to become the unfortunate target of a flea with unusually ambitious career goals. At this point, you might finally believe life is becoming manageable. You'd be wrong. Because in medieval Europe, your biggest enemy wasn't always disease. Sometimes, it was your job. Today, many of us complain about overflowing inboxes, awkward video meetings, or the office printer deciding it has developed strong personal opinions. Medieval workers had different concerns. Like, Will this roof collapse on me today? Or, will that horse decide I'm standing in exactly the wrong place? Or perhaps, I do hope the village blacksmith doesn't accidentally remove one of my fingers. Perspective is a wonderful thing. Let's begin in the fields. Because for most people living in medieval Europe, life started here. Before the sun appeared over the horizon, farmers were already awake. There were no alarm clocks, no phone buzzing beside the bed. Instead, roosters, church bells, habit, years of repeating exactly the same routine. The workday followed the sun. When daylight arrived, so did work, and there was plenty of it. Fields didn't care whether you felt tired. Wheat continued growing. Animals still needed feeding. Fences still needed repairing. Nature has always been a remarkably demanding employer. Imagine lifting heavy sacks of grain, again and again, then carrying buckets of water, kutinay, digging soil, repairing broken tools, all without modern machinery. Everything depended on muscle, human muscle, animal muscle. That was the entire workforce. If something heavy needed moving, someone simply moved it. Eventually, slowly, usually while making the same exhausted noises humans have made for thousands of years. Back pain wasn't unusual. It was expected. Arthritis appeared early. Joints wore out. Hands became rough and scarred. Modern archaeologists often examine medieval skeletons and immediately recognize years of hard labor. Bones quietly record the story of someone's life. Shoulders reveal repetitive lifting. Knees reveal endless kneeling. Spines reveal decades of carrying impossible loads. The skeleton remembers everything, even after the person is long gone. Harvest season brought its own special excitement. And by excitement, I mean exhaustion. Entire communities worked together. Men, women, teenagers, children old enough to help. Everyone joined in, because crops waited for no one. If rain arrived before the harvest finished, months of work could disappear. So people pushed themselves. Long hours, little rest, sharp sickles flashing beneath the summer sun. It only took one careless moment, one slip, one distracted glance, and suddenly that sharp farming tool found your hand instead of the wheat. There were no emergency rooms, no ambulances, just cloth bandages, hope, and perhaps the village healer if you were fortunate. Let's wander into the village blacksmith's workshop. You hear it before you see it. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythmic sound echoes through the street. Inside, the air feels almost alive. Heat rolls from the forge in heavy waves. Smoke curls toward the roof. The smell of burning coal mixes with hot iron. The blacksmith stands surrounded by sparks. To modern eyes, it looks incredibly dangerous. To medieval eyes, it's Tuesday. The blacksmith made almost everything. Nails, knives, horseshoes, door hinges, axes, tools. Without blacksmiths, villages simply stopped functioning. It was essential work. It was also spectacularly hazardous. Molten metal doesn't care how experienced you are. Neither do flying sparks. Burns happen constantly. A moment of distraction. A hammer striking at the wrong angle. A glowing piece of iron slipping unexpectedly. Even experienced craftsmen collected scars throughout their careers. In medieval Europe, your resume was often written directly onto your hands. Then there was the carpenter, a profession requiring remarkable precision. Wood became houses, furniture, bridges, carts, church roofs, castle gates. Everything began as a tree. Carpenters transformed forests into civilization, mostly using hand tools, axes, chisels, saws, planes. No electric equipment, no laser measurements, just experience, patience, and an impressive willingness to work several stories above the ground without what we'd recognize as proper safety equipment. Imagine balancing on wooden beams while constructing a cathedral, hundreds of feet above the street. No hard hat,
No harness.
no safety inspector gently reminding everyone about regulations. Simply confidence, faith, and a strong preference for not looking down. Some builders spent decades constructing a single cathedral. Imagine beginning work as a young apprentice and finishing as an old man. If you lived that long, generation after generation continued the same project. The person placing the final stone might never have met the person who laid the foundation. History occasionally asks for extraordinary patience. Of course, construction sites attracted accidents. Heavy stones slipped. Scaffolding failed. Walls collapsed. Simple miscommunication could become catastrophic. Nobody intended these disasters. Buildings simply demanded respect. Gravity has always enforced its own rules, without exception. Now let's step into a medieval bakery. It smells wonderful. Fresh bread, warm ovens, roasted grain. Finally, something comforting. Except medieval ovens were enormous. Once heated, they stayed dangerously hot for hours. Open flames surrounded workers every single day. Loose clothing, dry wooden buildings, flying embers. One careless movement, and suddenly the village baker faced much bigger problems than burnt bread. Fire frightened medieval communities more than almost anything else. Not because people feared flames themselves, because nearly everything around them could burn. Homes were often built from timber, roofs covered with thatch, workshops packed with dry wood. One spark could leap from roof to roof with terrifying speed. Entire neighborhoods sometimes disappeared in a single afternoon. Imagine watching years of work vanish because someone accidentally dropped a candle. That nightmare remained permanently in the back of everyone's mind. Speaking of candles, night itself created challenges. Once the sun disappeared, light became expensive. Candles required wax or animal fat. Oil lamps needed fuel. Most families used light sparingly. Rooms became dim. Shadows stretched across walls. Walking through your own home after dark required caution. Stub your toe today. You laugh. Trip beside an open fire in medieval Europe. The evening becomes considerably more memorable. Let's visit the village mill. Its giant water wheel turns steadily beside the river. It seems peaceful, almost relaxing, until you remember. Those enormous wooden gears could crush almost anything caught inside them. Loose clothing, hair, hands. Millers worked around powerful machinery centuries before anyone imagined protective guards. The mill never became tired, never slowed. If something became trapped, the wheel simply kept turning. Nature powered the machine. Nature rarely accepts complaints. Even gathering firewood carried risks. Forests weren't theme parks. Trees fell unpredictably. Axes slipped. Branches snapped overhead. Winter demanded enormous quantities of wood. Without enough firewood, families froze. With firewood, someone still had to cut it. Every practical solution introduced another practical danger. Medieval life excelled at these little trade-offs. Now imagine working with animals. Oxen pulled plows. Horses hauled wagons. Cows provided milk. Pigs wandered almost wherever they pleased. Animals were valuable. They were also animals. A horse could kick. An ox could panic. A frightened cow weighing well over 1,000 pounds suddenly becomes everyone's problem. Farmers understood animal behavior remarkably well. Still, every experienced farmer could probably tell stories about the day a perfectly calm animal unexpectedly decided otherwise. Some lessons were learned the hard way. Fishing sounds peaceful. Sit beside a river. Cast a net. Enjoy the fresh air. Reality proved slightly less romantic. Cold water. Slippery rocks. Unpredictable currents. Storms appearing without warning. Small boats overturning. Many medieval communities depended heavily on fish. especially during religious fasting periods. Someone had to catch them. Not everyone returned home. Rivers appear calm. Until they aren't. Then there were miners. Perhaps the most dangerous profession of all. Deep underground. Darkness. Dust filling every breath. Narrow tunnels supported by timber. The constant possibility of collapse. No electric lights. Only flickering lamps. Air growing thinner the deeper you traveled. People mined iron, lead, silver, salt. The wealth of kingdoms often began beneath the earth. Extracting it demanded extraordinary courage. Or extraordinary desperation. Sometimes both. A tunnel might remain stable for years. Then one ordinary afternoon. It didn't. History remembers the silver. It rarely remembers the miner who found it. Now let's pause. Because it's easy to imagine medieval people constantly terrified. Most weren't. Danger became ordinary. When you grow up around risk, your definition of normal quietly changes. The blacksmith didn't wake every morning expecting disaster. The farmer didn't stare nervously at every horse. The baker didn't spend all day worrying about fire. They simply worked. Carefully. Skillfully. Confidently. Just as modern construction workers don't spend every shift imagining cranes falling from the sky. Humans possess a remarkable ability to adapt. Sometimes that's our greatest strength. Sometimes it encourages us to underestimate danger. As evening approaches, workers slowly return home. Hands blistered, boots muddy, clothes covered in dust or flour or sawdust depending on the trade. Children run to greet exhausted parents. Simple suppers wait over the fire. Someone stretches an aching back. Someone else quietly examines a fresh scrape earned during the day. Nothing serious. Just another ordinary Tuesday. That phrase appears often in history. Ordinary Tuesday. Because most lives weren't shaped by dramatic battles or royal weddings. They were shaped by thousands of ordinary workdays. Some difficult, some peaceful, some ending with tired smiles around the dinner table. Others, ending a little too soon. And tomorrow, our traveler leaves the village behind. We'll follow merchants onto dangerous roads, climb aboard crowded ships, and discover why simply traveling from one town to another could become one of the most dangerous adventures in medieval Europe. As it turns out, sometimes the journey itself was the greatest risk of all. Morning arrives once again. You've survived disease. You've survived hard labor. You've somehow managed to avoid being flattened by a runaway ox or setting yourself on fire while baking bread. Honestly, you're becoming surprisingly good at this whole medieval survival thing. Which is unfortunate, because today, you've decided to travel. A decision that sounds perfectly reasonable. Perhaps you're visiting family. Maybe you're taking grain to market. Perhaps you're a merchant hoping to make a few extra coins. Or maybe you're a pilgrim heading toward a famous shrine, convinced the journey itself will bring you a little closer to heaven. Whatever your reason, one thing quickly becomes clear. Leaving home is far more dangerous than staying there. The road doesn't particularly care where you're going. It only cares that you're on it. The first thing you'll notice is how slow everything feels. Modern roads encourage speed. Cars glide along smooth highways. Trains cover hundreds of miles in a single afternoon. Airplanes cross continents while you complain that the tiny bag of peanuts isn't quite enough. Medieval travel had a different philosophy. Mostly walking. Lots of walking. Hour after hour. Day after day. If you owned a horse, you were fortunate. If you owned a sturdy wagon, people probably assumed you were doing rather well. Most ordinary people relied on the oldest form of transportation ever invented. Their own feet. Which meant every journey became a test of endurance. Roads themselves weren't exactly welcoming. Some old Roman roads still existed, astonishingly durable after centuries of use. Those were the luxury option. Most routes were little more than worn tracks through fields and forests. When the weather stayed dry, travel was merely uncomfortable. When rain arrived, Everything changed. Mud swallowed wagon wheels. Horses struggled for footing. Boots became heavier with every step. Sometimes carts simply refused to move. Entire groups of travelers found themselves pushing together, grunting with effort, while a stubborn wagon remained deeply committed to becoming part of the landscape forever. The mud usually won the first argument. Bridges offered another adventure. Some were magnificent stone structures built generations earlier. Others looked as though someone had balanced a collection of logs over a river and wished everyone the best of luck. Crossing them required confidence, or perhaps optimism. Neither guaranteed success. Wood weakened over time. Floods damaged supports. Heavy wagons placed enormous strain on aging beams. Every crossing carried a tiny question. Will this bridge remain a bridge for another 5 minutes? Most of the time, yes. History tends to remember the exceptions. Rivers created problems even without bridges. Ferries connected many communities. Simple boats carrying people, animals, and wagons across moving water. The ferryman knew the currents. The passengers usually didn't. One overloaded boat. One sudden gust of wind. One nervous horse deciding this entire arrangement seemed unacceptable. And a peaceful crossing could become considerably less peaceful. Water has always demanded respect. It still does. Then there were forests. To modern hikers, forests often feel relaxing. Birdsong, fresh air, tall trees. A pleasant escape from city life. Medieval forests inspired rather different emotions. They were vast, dark, unpredictable. Roads disappeared beneath thick branches. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Travelers often moved in groups whenever possible. Not because the trees were dangerous. The trees were perfectly polite. It was the humans hiding among them that caused concern. Bandits existed, not in overwhelming numbers. Hollywood occasionally exaggerates this. But enough existed that travelers remained cautious. A lonely merchant carrying expensive cloth represented a tempting opportunity. So did pilgrims carrying donations. Or anyone who looked prosperous enough to own something worth taking. Most journeys ended peacefully. People traveled constantly. Trade depended on it. Still, every unfamiliar figure appearing on an empty road deserved at least a second glance. Sometimes, a third. Interestingly, many medieval robbers weren't dramatic villains wearing black cloaks. Some were simply desperate. Failed harvests. Debt. Hunger. History repeatedly demonstrates that poverty and crime often become uncomfortable neighbors. That doesn't excuse robbery. It does explain why it appeared. Human beings rarely wake up one morning thinking, "I'd quite like to become a highway thief." Life usually pushes people their one difficult decision at a time. Travelers developed their own survival strategies. Leave after sunrise. Avoid traveling alone. Reach the next village before dark. Stay near other merchants whenever possible. Listen carefully to local advice. If someone tells you the northern road has become unsafe, believe them. Maps weren't especially detailed. Local knowledge mattered enormously. The innkeeper probably knew more about nearby roads than any official document. Experience remained the greatest travel guide. Speaking of inns, eventually evening arrives. You've walked for hours. Your feet are sore. Your shoulders ache. The sun begins slipping below the horizon. Fortunately, there's an inn ahead. Now don't imagine polished wooden floors and fluffy white pillows. This is a medieval inn. Standards are flexible. The building is busy. Very busy. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, farmers. A couple arguing quietly in one corner. Someone snoring already despite it barely being sunset. The smell is a fascinating mixture of stew, smoke, damp wool, horses, and humanity. Not terrible. Not wonderful. Simply lived in. If you're wealthy, perhaps you rent a private room. Most people cannot. Instead, several strangers share the same sleeping space. Beds are valuable. Sometimes 2 or 3 travelers use one. Occasionally, people simply sleep on the floor. Privacy remains a luxury. Your roommate might be a cloth merchant from another kingdom, or a monk, or someone who snores with enough enthusiasm to frighten nearby livestock. Luck plays an important role. Then there's the food. After walking all day, almost anything tastes wonderful. A thick vegetable stew, fresh bread, perhaps a little cheese. If fortune smiles upon you, some roasted meat. Traveling burned enormous amounts of energy. People ate heartily whenever they had the chance. Nobody counted calories. Surviving tomorrow required plenty of them. Conversations filled the common room. This was medieval Europe's version of social media. News spread from table to table. Kings declaring wars. Markets offering better prices. Roads damaged by floods. A monastery needing repairs. A lord raising taxes. A village celebrating a festival. If you wanted information, you listened carefully inside inns. Every traveler carried stories. Some accurate. Some less committed to accuracy. One merchant might casually mention seeing wolves the size of horses. Another claimed a nearby town had chickens that laid eggs twice as large as normal. Travel has always encouraged exaggeration. Apparently, that tradition is eternal. Now imagine you're a merchant. Your wagon carries expensive cloth worth months of income. Every mile matters. Rain delays you. Broken wheels delay you. Sick horses delay you. A damaged axle could strand you for days. Replacement parts weren't available at the nearest service station. Someone had to build them, usually by hand. Time meant money, and every unexpected delay quietly emptied your purse. Merchants needed patience almost as much as profit. Let's climb aboard a ship. Sea travel often proved faster than roads. It also introduced entirely new ways to regret your decisions. Medieval ships were remarkably capable. They crossed enormous distances, connected kingdoms, delivered spices, wine, wool, timber, and countless other goods. But comfort was not their strongest feature. Cabins were cramped. Food grew repetitive. Fresh water became stale. Storms arrived without warning. Seasickness affected beginners with ruthless efficiency. Some passengers spent entire voyages wondering whether dry land had perhaps been unfairly underappreciated. Storms at sea possessed extraordinary power. Waves towered above wooden ships. Wind tore at sails. Rain blinded sailors. Captains shouted orders almost nobody could hear. The sea has always reminded humanity that confidence and control are two entirely different things. Even experienced sailors respected storms. Arrogance rarely survives the open ocean. Pirates occasionally appeared too. Not constantly, but often enough to worry merchants. Cargo represented wealth. Ships represented opportunity. Naval escorts existed in some regions. Many merchants traveled together for protection. Once again, there's safety in numbers. That lesson appears repeatedly throughout history. People are generally stronger together. Winter made travel dramatically harder. Snow covered roads. Ice hid beneath muddy paths. Mountain passes closed entirely. Rivers flooded after heavy rain or spring thaw. Sometimes travelers simply waited weeks for conditions to improve. Nature decided the schedule. Human beings adapted. Complaining didn't melt snow, although countless people undoubtedly tried. Let's spare a moment for messengers. Kings relied upon them. So did nobles, monasteries, merchants. Entire governments functioned because ordinary people carried letters across extraordinary distances. Imagine riding day after day with news that could change a kingdom. Every bridge mattered. Every horse mattered. Every delay mattered. History occasionally turned because one exhausted rider arrived a few hours too late. Timing has always been surprisingly important. Pilgrims filled many roads. Some traveled hundreds of miles. Others crossed entire countries. Faith inspired remarkable endurance. People accepted blisters, rain, cold, heat, because reaching a sacred destination meant everything to them. Along the way they met strangers from distant lands, shared meals, shared stories, sometimes shared illnesses too. Travel connected Europe in countless ways, not all of them beneficial. Eventually, after days or perhaps weeks, your destination appears. Church towers rise above the horizon. Smoke drifts gently from chimneys. Children play beside the gates. You made it. You're tired, dirty, probably smell like a horse even if you never owned one. But you're alive, which, considering medieval travel, counts as a successful trip. You greet relatives, unload your goods, thank whatever combination of skill, luck, and favorable weather carried you safely here. Tomorrow, life continues, because medieval journeys never truly ended. Soon enough, someone had to make the return trip, and every road remained exactly as dangerous as before. As night settles over another unfamiliar town, you lie beneath a rough wool blanket listening to distant conversations from the common room below. A horse stamps its feet outside. Rain begins tapping gently against the roof. Somewhere nearby, a traveler quietly coughs. Another sharpens a knife before tomorrow's journey. The fire crackles. The inn slowly falls silent. You've crossed forests, bridges, rivers, mountains, and somehow arrived safely. Not everyone did. The road offered opportunity, trade, friendship, adventure, but it demanded something in return: patience, preparation, and a healthy respect for how quickly ordinary journeys could become extraordinary. Next time, we'll step away from roads and into one of the most dangerous places in medieval Europe. Not a battlefield, not a plague-ridden city, but your own home. Because as strange as it sounds, sometimes the greatest danger was waiting for you right behind your own front door. After weeks of wandering muddy roads, crossing creaky bridges, sharing rooms with strangers who snored like distressed oxen, and surviving enough questionable meals to make your stomach deserve a medal, you've finally made it home. There's something comforting about seeing your own front door again. Your own bed, your own fireplace, your own family. Even if your bed contains a few overly enthusiastic fleas, at least they're familiar fleas. Home feels safe. It feels predictable. It feels like the one place where nothing terrible could possibly happen. Unfortunately, medieval homes had a remarkable talent for proving people wrong. Because the place designed to protect you from the dangers outside often created entirely new dangers inside. Let's begin with the house itself. If you lived in a village, your home was probably built from timber, wooden beams, wattle walls woven from thin branches, a thick layer of mud or clay spread over the walls to keep out the wind. The roof might be covered with straw, or reeds, or wooden shingles if you happened to be wealthier than most. It wasn't a bad design. In fact, many medieval houses stayed surprisingly warm. They were built using local materials. People understood their environment remarkably well. The problem wasn't the construction. The problem was, almost everything could burn. Imagine standing in the middle of your cottage. Around you are wooden walls, wooden furniture, wooden shelves, wooden spoons, dry straw beneath the roof, a roaring fire in the center of the room, candles flickering nearby, oil lamps adding a little extra light. It's almost as if the house had been designed around one very optimistic assumption: that nothing would ever accidentally fall into the flames. History suggests things fell into the flames quite often. Fire wasn't simply useful. It was absolutely essential. Without it, there was no warm dinner, no heat during winter, no hot water, no light after sunset. The fireplace was the heart of every home. Families cooked beside it, talked beside it, children played beside it, grandparents told stories beside it. Entire lives unfolded around those glowing embers. Which also meant Everyone spent an astonishing amount of time sitting next to an open fire. Eventually, someone became careless. Not because they were foolish. Because humans have always become comfortable with familiar dangers. You stop noticing what you see every single day. Modern people hardly think about staircases until they miss a step. Medieval people stopped thinking about fire until it reminded them. A single spark drifting upward into a dry thatched roof could become a disaster. At first, perhaps just a little smoke. Someone notices. A bucket of water appears. Maybe the flames disappear. Or maybe a breeze arrives. The fire climbs through the straw, then into the wooden beams. Within minutes, neighbors are running toward the house carrying buckets. Children hurry outside clutching blankets. Dogs bark. Horses panic. The village bell begins ringing wildly. Not for church this time. For survival. There were no professional firefighters. No fire engines. No emergency phone number. The fire brigade was everyone. Every neighbor. Every passerby. Anyone carrying two reasonably functional arms. People formed long lines from the nearest well. Buckets passed hand to hand. Over and over again. Sometimes they saved the house. Sometimes they saved the neighboring houses. Sometimes they simply watched the flames consume everything. Because once a fire truly took hold in a medieval village, there wasn't much anyone could do except stop it from spreading further. Entire towns disappeared this way. Not because someone intended harm. Because someone dropped a candle. Or forgot glowing ashes beneath a pile of straw. Or left bread in the oven a little too long. History occasionally changes because of emperors. Sometimes it changes because of one particularly unfortunate ember. Now let's talk about smoke. Oddly enough, even when your house wasn't burning, it was still full of smoke. Many early medieval homes had no proper chimney. Instead, smoke drifted upward toward small openings in the roof, or escaped through the doorway. Eventually, mostly, some of it preferred staying inside, which meant families breathed smoke every single day. Morning, afternoon, night, year after year. Children grew up in smoky rooms. Grandparents spent decades beside smoky fires. Nobody thought this unusual, because everyone lived exactly the same way. Modern doctors would probably have several opinions. Most of them beginning with, "Please open a window." Eyes watered constantly. People coughed. Walls darkened with soot. Ceilings slowly turned black. If you visited a medieval cottage after several years, you might notice the wooden beams above had become almost completely coated in smoke. A permanent reminder that comfort often came wrapped inside inconvenience. Warmth had a price. It just wasn't paid immediately. Then there were candles. Lovely little inventions. Quiet. Gentle. Useful. Also remarkably talented at starting fires. Most ordinary candles were made from animal fat. They smoked. They smelled. Sometimes they dripped hot wax everywhere. The wealthy preferred beeswax candles. They burned cleaner. They smelled better. And they cost considerably more. Apparently, even candlelight obeyed medieval class differences. Picture a tired farmer after a 14-hour workday. He lights a candle, sets it beside the bed, sits down. Perhaps he falls asleep. We've all been there. Well, not beside an open flame, hopefully. One forgotten candle could quietly transform an ordinary evening into a catastrophe before sunrise. People understood this risk. But understanding danger doesn't always prevent accidents. If it did, modern emergency rooms would be much quieter. Let's move into the kitchen. It's dinner time. A large iron pot hangs above the fire. Stew bubbles slowly. The smell is wonderful. Onions. Herbs. Fresh bread. Maybe a little pork if fortune has smiled recently. It feels cozy. Except that enormous pot weighs quite a lot. Hooks fail. Chains break. Wood weakens. Imagine leaning over to stir supper, when several gallons of boiling stew suddenly decide gravity deserves another opportunity. Burns happened. Frequently. Cooking remained one of the most dangerous household jobs, especially for women, who spent long hours near open fires preparing meals. History remembers kings. It rarely remembers the countless cooks quietly risking injury every single evening. Children made everything more interesting, as children generally do. A toddler wandering toward a fireplace. Another pulling at a hanging pot. Someone chasing the family dog directly across the cooking area. Parents developed astonishing awareness. They had to. Even so, accidents happened. Curiosity has always been one of childhood's greatest strengths. It's also occasionally exhausting. Now let's visit the bedroom. Finally, a chance to rest. Except, your bedroom has its own collection of surprises. The straw mattress we mentioned earlier hasn't improved. In fact, it may have become considerably worse. Over time, dust collects, moisture settles, tiny insects multiply. Sometimes mice decide the mattress looks surprisingly comfortable. Sharing your bed with wildlife wasn't exactly uncommon. Not because people enjoyed it, because keeping every tiny creature outside proved almost impossible. Houses weren't airtight. Doors had gaps. Walls had cracks. Nature is remarkably persistent. If a mouse wanted to move in, it usually didn't bother asking permission. Speaking of mice, they loved grain. Families stored precious food supplies inside the house whenever possible. Bags of wheat, barrels of oats, dried beans. Unfortunately, humans weren't the only ones interested. Mice arrived, then rats, then cats. Occasionally dogs chased everyone. Your home often resembled a tiny ecosystem negotiating daily ownership rights. Food storage itself required careful planning. Too much moisture, grain spoiled. Too much warmth, mold appeared. Leave food uncovered. Insects celebrated. Every meal represented months of hard work. Losing winter supplies wasn't merely inconvenient. It could become life-threatening. Families checked stored food constantly. One bad harvest already created enough problems. Nobody wanted hungry mice making things worse. Winter transformed the house completely. Doors stayed shut. Windows remained closed. Families gathered close together for warmth. Animals sometimes shared the same building. A cow produced heat. So did sheep, goats. It sounds unusual today, but during freezing weather, warmth mattered far more than personal space. Imagine waking up beside your family and hearing a cow quietly chewing breakfast a few feet away. Strange. Certainly. Practical? Absolutely. History often chose practicality over elegance. Now imagine a winter storm. Snow piles against the walls. Wind whistles through tiny cracks. The fire burns day and night. Someone must keep feeding it, hour after hour, even while everyone sleeps. If the fire dies completely, the house becomes dangerously cold. If the fire grows too large, well, you already know how that story sometimes ends. Keeping exactly the right balance required constant attention. There was no thermostat, only experience. Storms themselves brought another problem. Roofs leaked. Heavy rain soaked thatch. Strong winds tore away sections of roofing. Families climbed onto slippery roofs to make repairs whenever weather allowed. Not because they enjoyed rooftop adventures. Because sleeping beneath the stars in December loses its charm surprisingly quickly. Falling from roofs became another entirely ordinary household hazard. Gravity remained remarkably busy throughout medieval history. Let's spare a thought for wells. Most villages depended on them. Every day someone carried heavy buckets home. Water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, livestock. One trip wasn't enough. Neither were two. People walked back and forth constantly. Imagine carrying two heavy wooden buckets suspended from a pole across your shoulders. Now imagine doing that several times every day for years. Backs ached. Shoulders hardened. Occasionally someone slipped beside the well itself. Simple chores quietly demanded extraordinary endurance. Then there was the cellar. Cool. Dark. Perfect for storing food. Also perfect for damp floors. Loose stones. Unexpected spiders. The medieval cellar wasn't exactly terrifying. Just easy to underestimate. One misplaced step carrying a heavy barrel, and suddenly your evening becomes considerably more complicated. Again, ordinary dangers. Not dramatic. Just endlessly patient, waiting for someone to stop paying attention. Despite everything, home remained people's favorite place. Children still laughed around the fire. Parents still celebrated birthdays, weddings, and harvest feasts. Grandparents still shared old stories. Neighbors still visited. Music still filled cottages during festivals. Love existed here. Comfort existed here. Home wasn't dangerous because it lacked happiness. It was dangerous because life itself required constant interaction with things capable of causing harm. Open flames. Sharp knives. Heavy tools. Stored grain. Smoke. Animals. Hard work. They were woven into everyday life so completely that people rarely stop to think about them. As night settles over the village once more, the last candle is carefully blown out. The fire is covered with ashes to keep a few glowing coals alive until morning. Outside, an owl calls from somewhere beyond the fields. Inside, everyone slowly drifts to sleep. Parents, children, the family dog, perhaps even the cat, assuming it has finished its nightly negotiations with the local mice. The house grows quiet, peaceful, safe. At least, safe enough. Tomorrow, however, we'll discover that nature itself had one final collection of unpleasant surprises. Because even if disease spared you, even if fire spared you, and even if hard work spared you, the weather, wild animals, famine, and the natural world still had their own ideas about how your medieval story might end. So, here we are. You've made it through almost everything medieval Europe has thrown at you. You survived diseases that arrived without warning. You avoided dangerous workplaces. You crossed roads that seemed determined to make every journey difficult. You returned home without accidentally turning your cottage into a pile of ashes. At this point, you might believe you've finally discovered the secret to medieval survival. Work hard. Be careful. Stay healthy. Keep away from suspicious food. Simple enough. Unfortunately, there was one opponent no medieval person could ever truly defeat. Nature. No king could command it. No knight could fight it. No treasure could buy protection from it. Nature followed its own rules. And sometimes, those rules were very harsh. Modern life has given us countless protections. Heating keeps us warm. Air conditioning keeps us cool. Supermarkets provide food even when seasons change. Weather forecasts warn us when storms are coming. Medicine protects us from illnesses that once terrified entire communities. When a winter storm arrives today, we might complain about canceled plans. For medieval people, a winter storm could decide whether a family survived. A failed harvest could mean hunger. A flood could erase years of work. A terrible winter could change the future of an entire village. Nature was not just scenery. It was something people had to negotiate with every single day. Winter was one of the greatest challenges, especially for ordinary families. The cold itself was only part of the problem. The real danger came from everything connected to it. Food became harder to find. Travel became difficult. Animals needed extra care. Firewood disappeared quickly. Every household entered winter asking the same question. Do we have enough? Enough grain? Enough fuel? Enough warm clothing? Enough food for the months ahead? And perhaps, enough luck? A winter morning began early. There were no comfortable excuses to stay in bed. But nature was unpredictable. Too much rain. Too little rain. A storm at the wrong moment. A cold summer. Small changes could create enormous problems. A few weeks of bad weather could affect thousands of lives. Animals were another challenge. Cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens. These were not simply animals. They were survival. A cow provided milk. Sheep provided wool. Pigs provided food. Losing an animal could hurt a family for years. Farmers protected their animals because they understood something important. Their future depended on them. Storms brought another danger. Today, storms can be frightening. But medieval communities often had little warning. The sky darkened. Winds grew stronger. Rain arrived. And everyone hoped their homes survived. Storms damaged roofs, destroyed crops, flooded roads, interrupted travel. For coastal communities, the sea was both a friend and an enemy. It provided food. It provided trade. But it could also take everything away. Floods were equally destructive. Rivers were essential. They provided water, transportation, fishing, power for mills. But rivers could become dangerous very quickly. Heavy rain transformed peaceful streams into powerful floods. Fields disappeared underwater. Bridges collapsed. Homes filled with mud. People rebuilt because they had no other choice. Medieval communities became experts at rebuilding. They had to. Even animals could create problems. Wolves were feared, not because every forest was full of monsters, but because desperate animals behaved differently. A hungry wolf during a harsh winter was a serious concern. Humans and animals competed for the same things: food, space, survival. Nature did not hate humans. It simply did not care about human plans. Even tiny creatures could destroy entire harvests. Locusts, small insects, capable of destroying fields that farmers spent months preparing. Imagine waking up one morning and seeing your entire year's work disappearing. No insurance. But nature was unpredictable. Too much rain. Too little rain. A storm at the wrong moment. A cold summer. Small changes could create enormous problems. A few weeks of bad weather could affect thousands of lives. Animals were another challenge. Cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens. These were not simply animals. They were survival. A cow provided milk. Sheep provided wool. Pigs provided food. Losing an animal could hurt a family for years. Farmers protected their animals because they understood something important. Their future depended on them. Storms brought another danger. Today, storms can be frightening. But medieval communities often had little warning. The sky darkened. Winds grew stronger. Rain arrived. And everyone hoped their homes survived. Storms damaged roofs, destroyed crops, flooded roads, interrupted travel. For coastal communities, the sea was both a friend and an enemy. It provided food. It provided trade. But it could also take everything away. Floods were equally destructive. Rivers were essential. They provided water, transportation, fishing, power for mills. But rivers could become dangerous very quickly. Heavy rain transformed peaceful streams into powerful floods. Fields disappeared underwater. Bridges collapsed. Homes filled with mud. People rebuilt because they had no other choice. Medieval communities became experts at rebuilding. They had to. Even animals could create problems. Wolves were feared, not because every forest was full of monsters, but because desperate animals behaved differently. A hungry wolf during a harsh winter was a serious concern. Humans and animals competed for the same things: food, space, survival. Nature did not hate humans. It simply did not care about human plans. Even tiny creatures could destroy entire harvests. Locusts, small insects, capable of destroying fields that farmers spent months preparing. Imagine waking up one morning and seeing your entire year's work disappearing. No insurance. More challenges. More uncertainty. But also, another chance. Because that was the greatest strength of medieval people. They woke up. They tried again. They kept going. So, as we leave medieval Europe behind, take a moment to appreciate the simple comforts around you. The warmth of your home. The clean water nearby. The soft bed waiting for you. The quiet safety of an ordinary night. Things that seem normal today were once incredible luxuries. Thank you for joining me on this slow journey through history. Now, turn down the lights. Get comfortable. Let the sounds of the past slowly fade away. And wherever you are, I hope you have a peaceful night. Sleep well. Good night.